Hi, I'm Matthew.
And I'm Safia Abdallah. I'm a principal software engineer on the .NET team here at Microsoft.
And I'm a product manager on the Functions team.
Awesome. And today we are going to talk to you about building and deploying an Azure Functions app with .NET Aspire in 25 minutes.
Yeah.
It's going to be a whirlwind. We're going to get started with a brief intro into both Azure Functions and .NET Aspire, and then we're going to jump into a bunch of demos, and then we're going to close it off with some Q&A. So Matt, what is Azure Functions?
Well, Azure Functions is a way of processing events and handling them with a piece of code that allows you to encapsulate just one thing that needs to process that event. And this is really powerful when you're dealing with larger distributed systems, right? Mm-hmm. Because let's say you want to do an asynchronous operation, your classic order processing scenario or something like that.
Yeah.
You'll have something go into a queue, and then you want a background task that actually does something with it. Similarly, maybe you want to just have something that runs on a schedule. Having a timer event and go in the background and do some processing, or even just watch your more long-lived data stores. So when something gets uploaded into a blob container, for example, then you could go ahead and have a function runs that, I don't know, let's say resizes an image or something like that.
Yeah.
But of course, you can do HTTP events and a whole bunch of others. But it's a nice way of saying that, as we have events flowing through the system, we're able to react to them and then target them with a very focused piece of code.
Right. That's pretty neat. And .NET Aspire is pretty helpful as well. It's a collection of tools, templates, and packages for building these observable and production-ready apps. When you're coding locally, Aspire makes it really easy to manage all of your projects, resources that those projects depend on, like Azure Storage Queues or Azure Storage Blobs, and any containers or microservices that you're interacting with. And one of the kind of cherries on top of Aspire is that it has a really great dashboard with real-time insights powered by OpenTelemetry that you can access at dev time. So you kind of get a sense of how your end-to-ends in your stack are working locally without having to deploy to staging or production. So as it turns out, the combination of both Azure Functions and Aspire
It's really good.
Can be really good. And Matthew, do you want to show them just how good it is with a demo?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's
All
go
right.
over to the demo right now. So I love to do my work in Visual Studio, so that's where I'm going to be. We're going to go ahead and just do a new project template. Let's use Azure Functions. We're going to go ahead and create this. And we're going to go ahead and pick .NET 9, but this can also work for .NET 8 just as well. You just have to have the .NET 9 SDK installed. So we have that. I've got an HTTP trigger here, and I have this lovely little enlist in Azure in .NET Aspire. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And as I create this project, it's going to create a standard functions project. Nothing super surprising there.
Okay.
But then it's also going to be provisioning the .NET Aspire app host and the service defaults project, which is going to contain a few things that we want to put throughout all of our different projects in the Aspire orchestration. So you can see it's scaffolding those out now. And we can see that we have 3 projects now created in the solution. Mm-hmm. Let's start with the Aspire one, the app host one specifically. And so this is where we have our distributed application. And so that's the collection of services that we were going to bring in. And then we have this add Azure Functions project method. And then we're just referencing the other project that actually represents functions here.
Okay.
So this add Azure Functions project is brought in by a new dependency, this Aspire hosting Azure Functions. And so with the preview support we have here, that's what allows us to bring things in, map in configuration to set up those triggers, and make sure that everything is flowing through nicely and working with the rest of the Aspire ecosystem.
Right, nice.
So if I look then at the functions project, we have a fairly standard setup here now using our host application builder support. So very familiar if you're doing other types of .NET things. We can get rid of this commented section. We don't need that.
Okay.
But I'm doing my fairly standard setup, configuring ASP.NET Core integration, and then I have this add service defaults. So this is injected by Aspire, and this is what's going to be bringing in, let me just make this a little bit smaller, things like setting up OpenTelemetry, all the service discovery for if I'm bringing in other services, setting up other defaults, and this is where I can kind of control things that will be put into every single one of the projects as part of my orchestration. So that's the service defaults project. Now for the function itself, well, we have the standard default template here, but that's not what we want to use today. So let's just scaffold out really quick a function that's going to take an HTTP request, and then it's going to accept image data, and then going to upload that into a blob store.
Got it.
So just a quick little upload function here that's going to write to this blob container, when we get the request coming in.
Got it. Now, where are you getting access to that blob container from?
So I wanted to do it through dependency injection here, but as we can see, things aren't necessarily resolved yet because I have a little bit of work to do yet. So let's go and add a new reference. Let's go add Aspire Azure Storage blobs is what we're looking for. Whoops. Yeah, there we go.
Nice.
So that's the reference we want. So this is what is the client-side integration that allows any project that you've enlisted into Aspire to start interacting with storage that's set up through the orchestration as well.
Nice.
So we can just accept all that. And then if I come back in here, I do still need to make sure that I'm actually wiring it through so that the dependency injection on the function side works. So we're just going to go add a quick builder.add Azure Blob client, and we're going to give it a name, blobs.
Nice.
Now, that name is made because that's going to reference the connection information that Aspire is passing in. So we also have to tell Aspire to go do that.
Right.
So I'm going to jump back over to the app host here. And this is where I'm going to set up my storage. So we'll very quickly go in and scaffold that out. So we have this add Azure storage. We're running it as an emulator. So if I F5, I get the storage emulator brought up, and then bringing in this blob service. Then on my functions project here, I just need to do a quick with reference and add that blobs object that we just created.
Nice.
So with this, Aspire will go ahead and set up everything for us in terms of those resources and then make sure that all that information flows into functions. Then from the function side, it registers the right dependency injection, and I'm able to use it in my function code.
Nice. And just a couple lines of code.
Yeah, not bad at all.
Pretty
So
neat.
from here, I'm just going to go ahead and set a breakpoint, and let's do it live.
Nice.
So what's going to happen here is, like we just said, Aspire is going to go ahead and provision everything we need. It's going to spin up all the services and the dashboard itself. So we'll see that pop up here momentarily. But it's really nice, especially when you have lots of projects that need to go all at once. And I set a breakpoint. We're going to hit that. But if I have multiple breakpoints across multiple projects, it's very easy to debug a bunch of things end to end. Yeah.
Nice.
So we can see that the Aspire dashboard popped up. Things are loading in. And so I have now that storage account that we created, as well as the blob service specifically within it. You'll also notice this other functions storage resource. So that add Azure Functions project is also setting up by default a storage, because Functions uses a storage account to coordinate a few different things, especially across multiple trigger types. And so it's already done one of those for us. You can also customize that if you want, make those all the same thing. But here, I've got all those spun up, and I have my actual Functions project here as well. I can go in and get a bunch of information about the project, all the environment variables that it's got, and things like that. Here, I'm just going to go ahead and grab the URL. And we'll also just go ahead and pop open the stream so that we can see what's going on. So I'll go over, and now let's upload an image. So I just got a simple file here, just showing a nice picture of a beach, and we're going to go ahead and bring that in. So let's bring in the actual function URL and type it right. And so this is going to go post that data. It's going to hit our breakpoint, which it already has. So let's go see what's happening. There we go. So we've got the context of things coming in. There's our file being brought in. Go ahead and disable this and then continue. And if I jump back, we can see I got my 201 created. And of course, all the same logs showing up in the stream here, which is great. So a good way of seeing what's going on in the project. Now, I've set this function up also to not really love having the same image uploaded twice.
Okay.
So if I do it again, we're going to hit a 409, telling us, hey, that's not really what we want to see, which is fine. And of course, I see the same thing in the logs, but it looks very similar.
Yeah.
A streamed log is not necessarily the way we want to debug our applications, especially when things go wrong, right?
Good point.
So that's where the Aspire integration with OpenTelemetry and bringing in all the structured logs and traces becomes really helpful. So if I'm trying to understand what's going on, I can very easily start filtering down and say, hey, I just want to see error level things. Okay. And turns out I'm seeing double logs here. So plenty of things in this preview that we're still improving and things like that. But the important thing is that the data is here, and I can drill in and see additional information about what version of the host is being used, and all the other integrations like the service ID, everything I would need. But importantly, the full trace is available here too. So I can see every interaction that occurred throughout the entire operation chain. And this is the magic to me. because now I can see, okay, well, I had this function get a call on its API, and then it started doing things interacting with storage. So it did a put against the storage count here and here. So that's the other resource that Aspire spun up. So I'm able to then see every call across every single resource.
Nice.
And so, especially when you get much larger applications where you have long call chains potentially as you're passing events around or other contexts, being able to go through and see exactly what happened the whole way through is it's kind of a game changer.
Awesome.
So, and yeah, that's all it takes to really get started and start seeing the benefits of Aspire. I mean, this is just the simplest example of, hey, we have one function project and one service in the blob container.
Yeah,
but,
totally.
There's plenty more that can be done from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So should we cut over to yours then?
Yeah, Matthew, I love what you've done. And I wanted to build a little bit on top of what you've started with the upload image endpoint. So we've got functionality using an HTTP trigger to upload an image that we want to resize to a blob container. But we don't really have any code that resizes it yet. However, I've helped us out with that. I'm popped into my favorite editor of choice, VS Code, with C# DevKit installed, and I've implemented a resize image trigger. And this resize image trigger is implemented using Azure Functions blob trigger. One of the things I want to call out here, Matthew, is you'll notice that I've provided a connection name to my blob trigger attribute. And this connection name is blobs.
Same as before.
Yeah, it's ringing a bell. As a matter of fact, this blob trigger and the blob output that I'm using to write out to the blob container that we're interacting with, both are connecting to that same connection reference that you used earlier in your HTTP trigger demo. And this is actually kind of pretty neat. You can use that Aspire client integration for Azure Storage blobs in both the standard Aspire model with the DI-injected blob service client, or you can use blob triggers and blob outputs from Azure Functions.
Yeah, it all becomes the same.
Yes, the same model. Now, here's the thing. There is some special logic that Azure Functions projects and Aspire do in order to be able to support using Aspire resources and blob triggers, blob outputs, other kinds of triggers. And what that means, Matthew, is that for preview, we're only supporting triggers for a particular subset of services. So let's see if we can get our list down. We've got Azure Storage Queues supported, Azure Storage Blobs supported, Azure Service Bus, and Azure Event Hubs. So any triggers that you're using that interact with those resources will work. And then, of course, HTTP triggers will also work, and timer triggers will work. And we're looking forward to bringing support for more triggers. This is one of the things we're really eager to hear from everybody about, what triggers would be the most impactful for their applications.
And you absolutely still can bring in other trigger types and doing other resource configurations. It's just, it's going to take a little bit more extra configuration.
Legwork to get it wired up. Yep, it's the legwork that the Azure Functions Aspire resource will do implicitly for you. You might have to do yourself.
I mean, that's at the core of what we want with functions as a service and things like that, right? Is own as little as possible and only write the code that's specifically
That's totally
yours.
your business logic. Absolutely. So cool, it did not take me much effort at all to wire up this blob trigger that uses Skia Sharp to resize images. I want to call out here that I'm also taking advantage of some modern C# features like primary constructors and file scope namespaces to really emphasize that most of the code here is business logic. There's not a ton of config or extra stuff going on. So that's pretty neat. I've got this resize image trigger implemented. But how do we know that it actually works? Well, you did a great job earlier demonstrating how you were able to F5 and debug into your Azure Functions trigger with Visual Studio. As a matter of fact, that same launch and debug functionality works in Visual Studio Code with C# DevKit. So if you take a look, I've sneakily started running my project. You'll notice in the corner here, I've got the debugger running with both my Aspire app host and my Azure Functions project that I'm running. If we hop over to my browser, we'll see that I've got that same dashboard instance that you were running before demonstrated on my machine. So that's pretty neat. Now what I want to do is go ahead and exercise some of the things that you demonstrated with being able to send a request up to the upload image endpoint that you created, but then also verify that my resize image trigger also runs. So your trigger will run when my HTTP request goes out, it'll put an image in the blob, then my blob trigger will run and resize the image, stick it back into the blob.
Perfect.
Let's see if we can see that end-to-end in action. So I'm going to jump back into VS Code, and I've got this request.http file, which I'm using to upload all of the various images of beaches that we are using to test this. We were joking earlier that Aspire and Azure Functions makes us so productive we can probably go to the beach right after this.
Yeah, we saved all that time.
Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and hit send request. All right, I'm getting confirmation. I saw that 201 created, which confirms that the image was indeed uploaded.
Right.
And what you're seeing here is I've actually hit the breakpoint in my resize image trigger. So your trigger succeeded, uploaded the image. Mine woke up, said, hey, something's been uploaded. Let me go ahead and resize it. We can confirm the name is beach3, which is the file that I just uploaded. We can go ahead and continue debugging from there. So that's pretty neat. I get that local debugging functionality across all of the triggers and code in my application. And if I'm not thoroughly convinced that the debugger is telling me that things work as expected, as you mentioned earlier, we have the ability to go into the structured log viewer and inspect our log messages. You showed how we can drill down by the log level. We can also do filtering based on any log messages that I'm emitting. So here's the instance where I just uploaded beach 3. You can see I was trying it out with beach 2 and beach 1 earlier. In my log entry, I have the ability to see the invocation ID, which is associated with the particular instance that we just debugged through. We can use this to filter more and explore end-to-ends for what is going on in our entire pipeline. This makes it really easy for me to debug without having to go to that black and white console log screen.
Right, and just there you could also see very easily which function, which component
which function was
brought
called.
that log out.
Yeah, and you can imagine this is going to be super helpful if you've got dozens of triggers in your Azure Functions project and you're trying to understand all of the interactions between them.
Monitoring across a bunch of distributed components is has to date been a challenge, but Aspire makes it so much better.
Absolutely. So, Matthew, I'm feeling pretty good about what we've built here.
Yeah,
I think I'm getting ready to ship it. Yes, let's ship it to the people. So here's the catch. We're going to need to do a couple of things before we can send our Azure Functions project in Aspire up to ACA. And some of the things we have to do deal with the fact that we are using a blob trigger. Because blob triggers in particular, require special role assignments on the Azure storage account that we want to connect with. Matthew, you might have to jog my memory. What are the 2 role assignments that we need on our Azure Storage Blob instance in order to get things working? I think it's...
well, so by default, you'll probably want storage blob data owner just to make sure that you have the basic pieces done. But then the storage account, you're going to at least want some level of reading permissions, but the storage account contributor assignment is what's needed against specifically the Azure Web Blob storage connection.
Got it. Okay, so there's some additional roles that I need to add. You did a great job running me through them. There's a couple of ways that I could set up these roles in my storage resources. I could use Bicep. I could maybe go into the Azure portal. Or, ding, 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 I can use Aspire and write C# code to configure the role assignments that I need in my permissions.
Yes.
And this really drills down one of the key things about this integration is everything that you can do with Aspire and use Aspire's API comes to Azure Functions. I want to show you this in a couple of ways in my application. The first is I've made a couple of modifications to the way that we register our Add Azure Functions project. Earlier, you talked about how you can customize host storage. That's the storage account the Azure Functions uses for its own bookkeeping.
Right.
One of the things you can do with the Aspire and Azure Functions integration is pass in a custom storage account or storage resource using the with host storage call. And what this is basically telling Aspire is, hey, don't pre-configure an Azure storage resource for me. I'm going to give you one, and I'm going to be able to customize it to my heart's content, and then use that one as host.
And that explains why your dashboard didn't have the extra entry.
Yes. Oh my gosh, you are so keen. Let's jump back into that. If we go to our resources, you'll see that I only have one Azure storage resource that's emulated locally, and it's called My Storage, and that's because I've done this work. And here I'm using the configure infrastructure API in Aspire to say that for this given storage account resource that I've identified by name, I want you to add the storage blob data owner role and the storage account contributor role, which I think sets me up for success with being able to wire these up.
That should be good.
And Aspire functionality doesn't just extend to this with host storage stuff. You'll notice I've got a couple of other calls that are chained into my Add Azure Functions project. I'm using wait for to indicate that I want my Azure Functions project to wait for the local storage emulator to launch, or maybe a storage account to be provisioned before launching, so I can start to sequence my resource dependencies.
Right. You may have seen when I jumped over to the dashboard,
yes,
the storage resources were still actually spinning up even though the Functions project had
yes,
gotten going.
Exactly. So this way we know that by the time our Azure Functions host spins up, all of the resources it needs have already been allocated. The other thing I've done is I've called this with external HTTP endpoints extension method, which will light up our Azure Functions project for public ingress so that we can actually send requests to that HTTP trigger that you provided. And that's all the massaging that I really need to do, specifically because I'm using a blob trigger and need to set up these additional role assignments in my application and want to also support public HTTP requests.
Right, so we're customizing the infrastructure that we're going to be provisioning
for deployment.
Fully for deployment, but within C#.
Yes.
That's cool.
Mind-blowing, I know, it's pretty darn amazing. So now is where I would do AZD up to deploy my Azure Functions project to ACA. This is where I'm going to pull a little bit of a Julia Child moment, a little bit of a chef's moment, and pull out my pre-baked deployment that I ran just a little bit ago. You could see I've got AZD up on my terminal. You could see that it's been deployed to an Aspire dashboard resource. I'm going to go ahead and open that up, load it in. It's happening live. And there we see that we've got our Aspire image resizer that's been deployed to the cloud. That's pretty neat, and we can view logs, interact with the dashboard in much the same way that we would locally in our deployment. And that's what you could do with AZD up in Aspire. So that's pretty neat. One of the things to note, Matthew, is that when you call AZD up in the way that I just did, what you're actually deploying to is plain old ACA containers for now. That's the phrase that I use. By default, we're not doing any auto-scaling using Kata for this deployment. That's something that's part of preview, but I think in the future, we're really going to do some interesting things with deployment here.
Being able to also have those scale-out events occur in response to the events flowing through the system makes it very nice, because then, we're able to meet whatever load of whatever, let's say that we upload a lot of images to that blob all at once. We want to make sure
a lot of beaches to go to.
Yep.
So that was quite the whirlwind, Matthew. We talked about creating Azure Functions project in Aspire. We debugged them locally in both Visual Studio and VS Code with C# Dev Kit. We tested locally and showed debugging and logging and telemetry, all of these good things. And then we deployed to ACA with AZD up. That was quite the whirlwind, and I think you have got some resources up for folks to check out.
Yeah, so let's jump back into the slides. We've got a QR code here that'll take you to actually all of the resources here. But there's lots of good stuff. We've been putting together lots of good, samples and things like that to help you kind of see how you can bring some of these things together beyond what we've just shown here today.
Yeah.
So lots of great stuff. And of course, this is also where, as we're going through preview, we want folks to be able to interact and let us know what kinds of things you need. What is the next trigger that needs to be fully integrated, things like that. So certainly, please file issues on the Aspire repo or the Functions Worker repo.
Awesome.
And just give it a try. There's also this AKA link that'll get you going just as well.
Awesome.